The movie opens in the busy yet calm streets of New York City. The scene slowly transitions into an apartment where we see a desperate woman named Ruja. She is on the phone with an unrevealed character, pleading with them to lend her some money for her daughter's eye treatment, but her pleas are disregarded. The call ends, and this leaves Ruja in despair and agony. While Ruja sits full of worry, her daughter Rachel approaches her. She asks her mother if she is going to go blind, and the optimistic woman tries to give her daughter hope, despite the visible contradictions. It's an emotional mother-daughter moment between the two, as tears roll while they hug. Later that night, Ruja is wide awake, though Rachel, on the other hand, sleeps peacefully. Maybe it's insomnia, or maybe it's the burden of her daughter's health that deprives the woman of sleep. Ruja gets up from the bed, careful not to wake her daughter up. She then goes to look at photos of her and her husband. The bereaved woman is nostalgic and in tears as she holds the picture frame tightly. Suddenly, the house lights flicker and there's a knock on the door. Ruja walks up to the door, curious as to who it could be. She first looks through the peephole to see who the individual visiting at this hour is. Through the hole, Ruja catches a glimpse of the man at the door. He introduces himself as Wichai, her father's friend, and he hopes she remembers him as he has something important to discuss with her. Ruja's countenance drops as she processes this strange visit. Wichai suddenly cuts through her thoughts and suggests that she come back to Thailand. Those words immediately grab her attention, and she quickly shifts her gaze back to the door. Concerned, Ruja asks Wichai how he found her. It's an unsettling encounter for Ruja. It gets more disturbing when, later, while in bed, she sees a terrifying figure lying beside her instead of Rachel. The old-looking persona warns Ruja not to go back. In that horrifying moment, the scene abruptly shifts to Ruja, waking up in a vehicle. Wichai stands outside the car and he informs her that they have arrived. Rachel and Ruja arrive at an apartment, which Rachel reveals is her grandmother's house. There's no one in sight yet. This allows Ruja and her daughter to have a look around the place. Despite her impaired vision, Rachel catches a quick glimpse of someone lurking, but they immediately disappear when she looks again. Ruja, who is busy looking at an old picture frame, soon realizes she has lost her daughter in this enormous apartment, and so she goes looking for her. There's no need to worry as Rachel is just looking at a painting on the wall in another room. Ruja takes her daughter by the arm, and they walk away. As they exit the room, Rachel asks her mother if they're moving into the apartment, but Ruja informs the curious little girl that they're only visiting. Just then, a woman named Da walks in. They exchange pleasantries, and Wichai enters the room, informing Ruja to join him in the studio. Ruja is uncomfortable leaving her daughter alone, but is left with no other choice, as Wichai wants to see her urgently, and kids are not allowed into the studio. Eventually, Ruja leaves Rachel in Da's care, and goes with Wichai. Rain pours heavily as she follows him into the studio. In the studio, Wichai shows Ruja two paintings her father made years ago. Ruja looks sternly at one of the paintings, but then it moves, startling her. Meanwhile, Wichai continues explaining. He tells Ruja that one of the paintings was sold for a huge sum of money, but then it was suddenly returned when the owner tragically ended the lives of his family, and then took. Before the man passed, he left a note stating that he was returning the painting to its creator. Wichai ends his narration with a slight chuckle, boasting that they now have the painting for free. As for the second painting, it never had a price tag on it, but now the two paintings have a buyer who is willing to pay a fortune for them. Wichai needs Ruja's permission first before he can proceed. In an indifferent tone, Ruja asks when they will receive the money. Wichai is rather shocked by her response. He inquires if she isn't, by any chance, curious about how her father passed away. When Wichai attempts to reveal how the old man passed, ending his Ruja prevents him from going any further. Wichai informs her that the paintings have some cracks that need to be fixed before they can be sold, and their only solution is an art restorer. Ruja then informs Wichai that she would need some help in selling the house once they are done with the funeral. Later, Rachel, who is all by herself in her room, hears strange sounds, and so she goes tracing it. She wanders off into a room, and as she enters, the door shuts on its own, making Rachel slightly unsettled. As she continues to walk, she finds a white fabric hanging down a wardrobe. Rachel walks to it and is about to grab it when Ruja suddenly appears. As Rachel's attention is taken away from the fabric, it is suddenly drawn back inside the wardrobe. Late at night, Da takes the red scarf she found on Rachel and ties it around a stick in an old house. She pleads to an undisclosed figure not to hold it against her. Suddenly, a strong wind begins to blow. Da is terrified as she attempts to flee, but she is stopped in her tracks by the same scarf she had tied, which has now mysteriously become longer and is now pulling her. Da screams in fear. On the other hand, Ruja is getting her daughter ready for bed. She brushes her hair while they talk. Rachel asks her mother why she can't see her grandfather's paintings, and Ruja reveals that it's because they're too scary. The scene then shifts to Ruja's younger self in the same position she is now, but this time with her mother getting her ready for bed. This scene reveals that Ruja also had questions about her father's painting when she was younger, and she had to promise her mother then not to go into her father's studio. The next day, Ruja is awakened by a frightening nightmare of being separated from her daughter. As she wakes up, the first thing on her mind is Rachel, but then, Rachel is nowhere to be found. In panic, Ruja goes searching around the house for her daughter, but she's just nowhere to be found. Fear begins to creep in Ruja. Waking up from a terrifying dream of losing her daughter and now waking up to her missing isn't what she would have hoped for. Relentless, Ruja continues searching. In the process, she bumps into Da, who has a bandage tied around her ankle as a result of the previous night. Ruja informs Da about her daughter's sudden disappearance, and Da suggests they split up to make the search more effective. Ruja goes deep into the woods to search for her daughter. She eventually arrives at her father's studio, swamped up with several emotions, anger and frustration. She begins to call for her daughter, a part of her wishing that her little girl is just playing a silly prank on her. Still in the studio, Ruja continues searching, and then suddenly sees a figure covered in a white sheet. The mysterious figure quickly wraps Ruja in the sheet, leaving her terrified and whimpering in fear of the unknown. Suddenly, a hand covers her eyes from behind, causing Ruja to forcefully make her way out of the studio as quickly as she can. Despite the frightening encounter in her father's studio, Ruja doesn't give up, and the search for her daughter continues. She calls for her in the woods, hoping for a response. Suddenly, like a calm to a raging storm, Ruja sees Rachel approaching. However, Rachel is not alone, but on the shoulders of someone. Ruja decides to save her questions for later and is just grateful to see her daughter safe and unharmed. She rushes to the little girl and hugs her tightly, pleased to have finally found her. After the brief reunion between the mother and daughter, Ruja begins inquiring where her daughter wandered off to. Rachel reveals that she had gone for a walk and that's where she found Tim, the kind stranger who is there to fix the paintings. Ruja warns her daughter about wandering off alone, but the little girl claims to have not been alone, but with a woman in a red scarf. Ruja immediately rebukes her daughter for uttering such words, and then they all head back to the apartment. Ruja and her daughter, as well as Tim, sit to have tea together. Da serves them, and just as she's about to leave, Ruja notices her ankle, so she inquires of Da. Da tells her it's just a sprain. Ruja then proceeds to ask what Tim was doing that led him to find Rachel. The man reveals that he paints landscapes and had gone to check certain places that were recommended to him. That's how he stumbled upon the stray girl in the woods. He offers to show Ruja some of his sketches, but then changes his mind and decides to draw Rachel. He finishes sketching Rachel and shows it to her, but the little girl isn't exactly pleased with his work and calls it ugly. However, Tim isn't offended by the girl's words and promises to make a better one for her next time. Ruja then inquires how long it will take for him to repair the damages on the paintings. Tim doesn't think it should take long since he has heard the damages are only minor. Later, Tim heads to the studio to inspect the paintings. Just as he looks, he finds a box on the floor and his attention is drawn to it. Inside the box are photographs. As he begins to go through them, he suddenly hears a sound and he immediately turns around. Tim then returns to look at the paintings, and then he finds a crack in the eyes of the character that didn't exist before. These strange cracks aren't only in the first painting, but in the second one as well. On the other hand, Ruja is giving out some instructions to her daughter. She urges Rachel to get her permission first before going outside. Rachel reveals that she likes Tim and hopes the set boundaries don't include him, but her mother makes it clear that he is not exempt. Just then, Tim enters the room. He asks Ruja to follow him to the studio as he wants to show her something urgently. It takes a lot to convince Ruja, but eventually, she agrees to follow him. Inside the studio, Tim shows Ruja the cracked paintings and tells her that he had no idea the cracks were that bad. Tim peels off a part of the paint and underneath is another painting. The two are shocked by this discovery and an unsettled Ruja demands that Tim puts back the piece he took out. Tim protests against this, inquiring if Ruja isn't by any chance curious about what is hidden underneath. Tim tries to convince Ruja, claiming it could raise the value of her father's paintings artistically. However, Ruja insists. Tim then teases Ruja about fearing that the paintings are haunted. This slightly offends Ruja, but Tim laughs it off. Tim then draws an instance of the Mona Lisa painting and informs Ruja of the rumors that claim if a person locks eyes with the Mona Lisa painting, her gaze would not leave such a person for a long while, and suggests they test it out on this painting as well. Ruja slowly becomes unsettled, but Tim carries out his thoughts anyway. He positions the painting in the center and asks Ruja to lock eyes with it and then walk in a different direction. Ruja obliges to test out Tim's theory. Just as she locks eyes with the painting and walks in another direction, the gaze of the character in the painting follows Ruja. Everything seems fine until the eyes in the painting move, startling Ruja so much that she almost jumps into Tim's arms. The frightened woman makes her way out of the studio, instructing Tim to just fix the paintings. Later, Ruja makes her way back to the apartment. The strange occurrences since she moved back to Thailand are beginning to overwhelm her. Just then, she sees Rachel in her old clothes. Ruja immediately snatches them from Rachel and yells that those clothes are meant to be burnt. Ruja begins to struggle with drawing the line between her memories and reality. It's all beginning to take a toll on Ruja's mental state. It gets even more aggravating when she hears her daughter scream and has to go check up on her. Rachel, who is seated on the bed, terrified, informs her mother that someone is under her bed. Ruja insists that there's nothing for her to be afraid of, but the little girl insists, and so Ruja has no other choice but to check. As Ruja bends down to check, at first, nothing is in sight, but then suddenly the curtains are rolled down and the doors are shut. Ruja then sees a scary-looking figure holding Rachel captive. This figure reveals that it has taken away Rachel's eyes. Just then, a snake crawls out and makes its way into Rachel's eye sockets. In that terrifying moment, a red scarf from nowhere pulls Ruja by the neck and drags her across the room. Ruja manages to set herself free, and her immediate thought is her daughter. She rushes to Rachel and carries her in her arms, immediately making her way out of the apartment. She bumps into Tim and she pleads with him to help her get out of there. At first, Tim wants Ruja to explain, but it's a matter of urgency, and there is no time for even words. Tim insists that it's pouring outside and it will be difficult to go anywhere with such weather. Eventually, the atmosphere calms. Tim offers Rachel an anklet and claims that it's for protection, as its tinkling sounds can chase away demons. Afterwards, Ruja thanks Tim for the anklet. The two talk and the conversation leads to Ruja inquiring why Tim didn't just stick with painting and decided to go the path of art restoration. Tim claims it pays, so why not? He also believes that the reason Ruja has gone through all of this trouble with the paintings is because of her daughter. Later, Ruja goes to check on the paintings in the studio with Tim. At first, she's reluctant about letting her daughter into the studio, but is then left with no other choice. However, she makes Rachel back the paintings and instructs her not to look at any of them. She even makes her pinky swear. Ruja then proceeds to look at the paintings and then sees that Tim has already begun to peel them off. He let his curiosity get the best out of him. On the side of the original painting is another painting of the face of the man who took. Ruja is concerned about this drastic move, but Tim tries to convince her that if they peel the whole thing off, they might get to know the truth. Ruja is enraged and claims that whatever the truth is, it doesn't concern her and Rachel, and she just wants him to get her out of there. The furious woman storms out of the studio with her daughter. That very night, Tim is obliged to take Ruja and Rachel out of the apartment. He drives them smoothly when all of a sudden the car breaks down, much to Ruja's dismay. The vehicle is parked in the middle of the woods with Tim struggling to start the engine. Meanwhile, Rachel, who is seated in the back seat, sees something approaching. As she looks through the glass to have a closer look, something suddenly lands on the door of her seat and she disappears. Tim and Ruja begin looking for Rachel together, but then Ruja disappears too. Ruja is now in another part of the woods, searching for her daughter, when from nowhere, that red scarf appears again. Ruja looks down at her ankle and sees the red scarf firmly tied around it. In a flash, it pulls her to the ground and begins to drag her down the forest. It takes her to another part of the woods. The red scarf disappears, and Ruja gets up on her feet and walks into the abandoned apartment in front of her. Inside, she finds a mysterious painting. Just as she looks, Ruja hears Rachel calling for her in the distance, so she immediately follows the voice. Fortunately, Ruja finds her daughter, but in danger. Da is about to throw Rachel into a deep pit. She's in tears as she pleads with Ruja to understand, claiming that she is left with no other choice. Rachel is terrified and screaming for help, and Ruja, who is concerned for her daughter, begins to plead with Da. Ruja claims Rachel is just a child and isn't involved in anything. Da then suggests that if that is the case, Ruja should jump in her stead. Da, in tears, continues to insist that she is left with no other option. She has made up her mind to throw Rachel into the pit, and just as she's about to do it, Tim intervenes, and Da ends up in the pit instead. Ruja immediately rushes to her daughter, thankful for Tim's intervention. They hurriedly make their way back to the studio, and an aggravated Ruja takes a blade and is about to rip the paintings apart, but Tim stops her. Just then, Rachel, who has been sitting down quietly all along, begins to talk strangely. Rachel turns to face them, standing on the stool she was once sitting on. She has her hair down and rough and her eyes fierce as she claims she is not Ruja's daughter and accuses Ruja's family of how she has ended up. Suddenly, the paintings begin to crack even more, and the little girl immediately jumps to Ruja and begins to strangle her. Tim attempts to get Rachel off Ruja, but is thrown across the room instead. Ruja succeeds in getting Rachel off of her without hurting her, and immediately, Rachel lands on the floor. Ruja rushes to her daughter to ensure that she's all right. Just then, the lights begin to flicker. Ruja and Tim get on their feet, and the paintings have a new look. More figures are added to the drawing, and just as Tim and Ruja observe the paintings, a terrifying figure jumps in front of them, but then disappears immediately into the darkness. The figure continues to appear and disappear in the darkness, startling the two. The lights continue to flicker, adding to the already tense atmosphere, and then, Ruja catches a glimpse of the figure behind Tim, and it throws her out of the room. Outside, Ruja bumps into Wichai. She makes no hesitation to plead with Wichai to take her and Rachel away from the premises, but Wichai wants to know exactly what's going on. He sees the painting, and they are not as he had left them. Suddenly there's a total blackout. Ruja wakes up to find herself tied up in the studio. Not only her, but Witcheye as well. Tim yields a weapon, and he begins to question the two. He has questions, and he wants answers. He wants to know what those paintings are really about. Witcheye begins to explain. One night, after a party, Pakorn selected only 2 of his close friends to stay for what he titled the real highlight he had prepared. Prang, his favorite model, was the star of the show. He wanted them to participate in what he claimed to be an artistic creation. The whole while, Tim has been an imposter, and he goes ahead to reveal the lifeless body of the real Tim. According to the plot, this fake Tim is responsible for the passing of the painting's first owner. This is where things begin to get scary for Witcheye, and he begins to plead for mercy. Tim grabs Witcheye's chin and makes him face the painting, demanding that he apologize to his mother. Ruja is terrified as she watches Tim take Witcheye's life and roll his body, which is dripping blood, away. The scene then shifts, and we see younger versions of Tim and Ruja. The two were friends, but Ruja's mother warned Ruja from associating with Tim and his mother, claiming that the two are ghost worshippers of the Hill tribe and bad people who hurt their family. She instructs young Ruja that if she pretends not to see them, they cannot hurt her. Young Ruja and Tim had witnessed the tragic passing of Tim's mum. Ruja's father had cruelly hung her up and made a painting of her while she suffered in agony, life slipping away from her. Tim blames Ruja. He claims she could have helped save his mother then. But young Ruja was blindly following the words of her mother to stay away from Tim and his mother. Tim reveals that after the tragic incident, he was thrown into a pit with his mother's corpse. He is utterly upset that Ruja and her mother witnessed her father's cruelty, but just ran away like it was nothing. Tim then proceeds to take Rachel out of where he had held her captive. Ruja pleads with Tim to not hurt her daughter, but Tim is driven by rage and pending vengeance. He takes out a rope, hinting at using it on Rachel. Ruja fears for her daughter's life as she pleads with Tim incessantly. Ruja offers herself to Tim in exchange for her daughter's safety, but Tim relishes watching her go through this torture. The same torture he had to go through when he watched his mother slip away from him, knowing he couldn't do anything to save her. Ruja apologizes to Tim and continues to plead for his mercy, but Tim is overwhelmed by rage. And all of a sudden at that moment, Tim accidentally gets bitten by a snake. This serves as a distraction for Ruja to free herself using a blade. However, this leads to a fierce battle between Ruja and Tim. The fight escalates, but Ruja manages to pierce the blade into Tim's thighs, but the man doesn't give up and continues to battle Ruja. Eventually, Ruja defeats Tim, and he lies on the floor badly injured. She then remembers the words of her mother to her years ago, instructing her to not let them hurt her. Ruthless, she sets the man's body on fire and immediately flees with her daughter. Ruja drives away triumphantly. She makes a vow to her daughter to protect her with her own life and ensure that she stays out of harm's way. Ruja takes one last glance at her daughter, who's fast asleep in the front seat. The scene then shifts back to the studio, where we see the paintings burning. As they continue to burn, the eye of the figure on the painting suddenly rolls, and the film ends abruptly. In the post-credits of the movie, we are taken back to a month earlier in the plot. We see an aged Pakorn walk into his studio, glancing at his 2 beloved paintings, when suddenly, a red scarf grabs his neck tightly and forcefully him on the roof of the building, with his legs dangling in the air.